I'm finally wrapping up the last of the servicing and repairs on our Mini Cooper. I've done a number of videos already, which you can check out in the cards above if you're interested, but this is the last one, at least for now. The main job we have left is to replace the front brake discs. The pads look to have been replaced relatively recently, but as our MOT noted, the front brake discs are now just ever so slightly below the minimum thickness that's listed by the manufacturer, so it's time to swap them out. You would think that doing brakes is generally a relatively easy task. I mean, it's, I think, the very first thing that I ever did when working on my own cars, and so generally it should be fine, but since these are minis and they are very prone to rust, things breaking, things seizing, all of that sort of stuff, it is what ended up being more difficult than I wanted. So let's talk about how you should do it and how I ended up having to get it done. Before you can do anything, you'll need to get the car up and off of the ground. I would note here that if you don't have an impact gun to remove the wheel bolts, you'll want to use your breaker bar and a 17mm socket along with your locking wheel nut key to loosen or crack the tension off of the bolts before you lift the car up, so that when you then go to lift it up, the wheel won't just spin when you try and undo those bolts. If you're planning on just working on the brakes on one side at a time, you can just use your jack to lift the car up, of course safely, and ideally with some chocks to stop the car moving, and of course with the handbrake on. But if, like me, you're planning on doing other work, like an oil change, which video in the cards above if you're interested, then you will want to jack up the car more securely with some jack stands. And for our case, we actually used my DIY wooden ramps to lift the car up just a little bit more so we could slide our jack all the way under the front and use the more central jacking points, basically the subframe, to lift the car up more centrally and put the jack stands under each side using the proper external jacking points for the jack stands instead. Once the car is up and off the ground, you can then remove the wheel bolts and remove the wheel. It's a good idea to place the wheel under the side sill of the car as just an extra bit of protection if your jack or jack stands were to give way at any point and you happen to be even remotely close to under the vehicle. It's a good safety sort of tip, and it keeps it generally out of your way as well. Then, once the wheel is out, the first thing you'll probably want to do is give the brake caliper in that area a quick wipe down or a brush down with a metal wire brush, just to get all of the dust and, in our case, rust that has collected on the bolts, on the surfaces, just so that you don't contaminate any of your shiny new brake surfaces or get that dust or rust in somewhere where it perhaps shouldn't be. Once it's clean, the first thing you'll then need to do is remove the metal wire clip on the outer edge of the caliper. Make sure that when you go to put everything back together, you do install that, as not having that installed or having it installed even just incorrectly is actually an MOT advisory, so worth keeping an eye. And then you can remove the plastic covers over the caliper slide pins. These are on the back side of the caliper, and they're just little plastic domes in a black plastic sleeve. They'll just pop out, even potentially with your fingernail or with a flathead screwdriver if you really need to. Once those are out, you can then use a 7mm hex or Allen key bit to remove the caliper slide pins. Yes, you will need to buy a 7mm hex or Allen key bit separately, because trust me, whatever toolbox you bought doesn't have a 7mm, it'll have 4, 5, 6, and then 8. Ask me how I know. I have many toolboxes. Anyway, once you have your 7mm specially acquired bits, you can then loosen the caliper slide pins, one at the top and one at the bottom. You can just leave these in place if you want. It's a good idea to pull them back slightly so that they don't catch when we take the caliper off, but it's also a better idea if you remove them fully so that you can give them a clean and apply fresh lubricant so that your caliper can slide freely when you're pushing on the brake pedal. Once the slide pins are either loose or removed, you can then pull on the caliper from the back to help effectively push the piston back into place to give a little bit more freedom for you to pull the caliper up and off. It's a good idea to pop the bonnet, which is a handle in the driver's side footwell, and then a latch on the, as you're looking at the car from the front, right-hand side headlights, or just left of that, to lift the bonnet and unscrew the brake reservoir cap. It just lets any pressure that you're pushing back into the system up and out, rather than compressing any air that's in the tank and making it more difficult than it needs to be. Once you have a little bit of play in the caliper, you can then lift it off and support the caliper in some way, whether that's placing it on one of the control arms carefully, using a bungee to secure it to the spring like we did, or anything that supports the caliper and makes sure that the brake line isn't in any way stressed is all good. You can then pull the brake pads off. The rear one should be clipped into the caliper, whereas the front one should be just resting on the caliper bracket. Remove both, and then it's probably a good idea before you go to take the caliper bracket off to insert a pry bar or a screwdriver into the brake disc, into the vents in the brake disc, so that when we go to remove the T50 screw that holds the brake disc to the hub, the brake disc won't just spin, it will be stopped by the screwdriver coming into contact with the caliper bracket. Now, that screw, depending on how old or how long that screw has been installed in your car, may be more of a pain than just anything on earth, really. So while it is a relatively large screw, it's a Torx T50 bit, so in theory it should have a lot of meat for you to be spinning on. It gets seized pretty tight, and if you want to ask me how I know, this is why. We tried everything we possibly could to remove this. We tried using a 3/8 ratchet. We tried then using a 1/2 inch ratchet. We tried using my impact driver, then my proper impact gun, and nothing would move it. We also tried plenty of penetrating fluid. We tried heat with a relatively small kind of butane torch. It's the best I've got. Unfortunately, no oxyacetylene to be had here. We also tried using a punch to hammer the edges, just to dislodge any of the sort of the rust that will be holding it in place. We tried scraping the edge of the sort of seams so that there's as little contaminants and rust in there as possible. We tried actually hammering the bit in and then using the impacts. Again, still nothing. And we even tried using a breaker bar. This seems like a bad idea, and to some degree it is, but when using the impact gun, after the second or third round of heating and then hammering, the bolt did look like it skipped forward or skipped out by just a slight nudge. So we then carefully, and I can't stress how carefully we were doing it, used the breaker bar to again make it jump another step, and we thought, success, finally! We gave it a bit more turn and then it snapped. Yeah. Fully, actually, so much so that the head of the bolt came off, as did some of the thread, but most of the thread is in the hub, which is fantastic. And I spent a long time trying to drill it out, then re-tap the hole, but most of my existing drill bits and bolt extractors are kind of naff and worn, so I have some more on their way, and I'll be properly fixing that shortly. If you have any suggestions, by the way, for how you would have got that bolt out instead, please do leave them in the comments down below. Like I said, I probably tried everything you could suggest, but if I missed anything, feel free to let me know and I'll use that the next time this inevitably happens. However you end up getting that bolt out, you do need it out to get the disc off, and once it is out, you can then use what ended up for us being a 16mm socket, although we were a little confused whether it should have been a 17 or 16. Either way, we ended up using a 60mm socket to remove the caliper bracket bolts. There's two on the back side. These are incredibly tight, so you will want to use a breaker bar or a lot of grunting and heaving, which is the option we went with, to get them off. And once they are off, you can then remove the caliper brackets and remove the old disc. Before you go and install your new discs, it's a really good idea to give them a bit of a wipe down with some brake clean and some fresh towels, as they ship with a thin film of oil, which stops them from rusting in the packaging, but that oil will contaminate your brake pads if you don't clean it off, and then you'll have less effective braking than you started with, which, well, very much defeats the purpose of working on your brakes. Once they're clean, you can then put the disc on the hub. If you haven't snapped and stripped out your bolt hole there, you can fit ideally a new screw to hold it in place. Although I should note that they're not technically a safety essential item, as the actual wheel bolts do hold the disc in place just fine, and they hold the disc and the wheel to the hub assembly with no problems. It's just a good idea to install that screw if and when you can, which is why I'll be replacing it and installing a new one in the very near future. Once the disc is on, you can then install the caliper bracket back in. Both of those bolts get torqued to 110 Newton meters, like really tight. So it's a good idea, especially on braking systems, to actually use a torque wrench where you can. And then you can start putting the caliper back on. Now, of course, if you're installing new brake pads as well, as is generally recommended, then you can install those here. But since mine are practically new, I'm going to be reusing the ones that were already on the car. You want to put the outer pad down into the caliper brackets and then place the caliper with the rear pad attached or clipped into the piston down onto your disc and onto the caliper bracket. You might find that if you didn't push the piston far enough back while taking the caliper off, it might not quite fit. So you'll need to take the front pad out and lever the disc, or lever the inner pad that's clipped into the piston against the disc and caliper bracket to push the piston back, or you can use one of the proper tools if you have one available. You can then place the caliper down, add some fresh lubricant to your hopefully nicely cleaned caliper slide pins and slide them in, and use your 7mm Allen key or hex bit to tighten them up. Those slide pins get torqued to 30 Newton meters, and again, with braking components, it is generally a good idea to tighten them to the torque spec, and then you can place the caps or the dust caps back over them so that they can stay as clean as possible. Don't forget to reattach the wire clip on the outside of the caliper. It's a bit of a pain to do. There's a bit of a technique to getting one side in and then clipping the other one on, and you might need a friend to help you, but it's definitely a necessary evil to get done, so make sure you do that. Then you can put your wheel back on, reattach all of your bolts, and once they are tight and as snug as you can get them with the wheel off the ground, you can then lower the car down so that the wheel is making contact with the ground, and use a torque wrench to tighten those to 120 Newton meters. If you want to go the extra mile, before you put your wheel back on, you can also flush and bleed your braking system, which would require you to crack the bleed nipple loose. In our case, it was a bit of a pain to do, so we ended up using a socket to crack it loose, and then used a spanner to open and close it with our sort of bleeding kit on. I'm using this one-man bleeder kit, which has a ball valve in the end to, in theory, allow you to do it completely solo, and mostly it does work, but since I have a friend helping me, I'm going to get him to be pressing on the brake pedal and holding it down while I then open the bleed nipple, letting the fluid out, close it, and then he can pump the pedal again, hold it down, and repeat that process until all of the air and nasty fluid is out. it's a good idea to make sure you top up your brake fluid reservoir before you do this so that you don't accidentally run too much fluid out and end up sucking air through the lines and having to do the whole process again. Of course, you'll then need to repeat all of those steps for the other side of the car. It's really important to keep your braking systems even, so if you're replacing the discs or pads on one side, you really do have to do it on the other as well. It is genuinely a safety factor, as you don't want uneven braking, especially under heavy braking, and have your car veer off to one side. So again, repeat on the other side, and then that's kind of it done. It is a bit of a painstaking process, especially with that T50 bolt that holds the disc on, but if you get lucky and you can remove that with relative ease, then first of all, congratulations, and second of all, it's otherwise a reasonably simple process to get done, and it's something that, again, you can save a fair bit of money doing yourself, assuming you don't end up breaking anything like I did and have to spend far too much on drill bits and bolt extractors and all that sort of stuff. But either way, that's it done. Of course, like I said, if you have any other suggestions for how to remove those sorts of stuck bolts, ideally without needing to drill them out, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. And if you have any questions or thoughts on the video in general, you can leave those in the comments as well. If you want to see more videos like this one on a weekly basis, then do hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification icon. I'll leave a couple of links to some tools in the description. Those are Amazon affiliate links that will take you to a local Amazon store where you can see, well, pick them up yourself, or you can pick up a hoodie or t-shirt like this one. This is the At the Wheel light design. There's also a dark design with black and white logo instead, if you prefer. But yeah, otherwise, thanks for watching. Feel free to check out some more videos on the end cards, including more guides and car reviews and a load of other stuff. And yeah, thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next video. Speaking of the Mini.